And honestly, I'm thinking themes in the early years should make a comeback. The reason I say this is based on the fact that we're seeing more and more children entering formal learning years with really poor vocabulary and language skills. But again, if you're going to teach themes well and deeply, it will mean integrating across subject areas and spending several weeks or even a whole term on this theme to make a truly meaningful experience, and one that is developmentally appropriate and where children can make connections to their own lives. Hello and welcome to Blooming Curious, the podcast that's all about nurturing that natural curiosity in our early years kids and students. I'm Edwina, your host from the Ed's Lessons blog, a passionate advocate for play and inquiry, and on a mission to keep children curious and questioning. The days of talk and chalk are over. We're diving into the world of integrated, inquiry and nature-based learning and exploring the strategies that create lifelong learners. So if you're a classroom or homeschool educator or even a curious parent, then this is the place for you. Why should you plan and teach an integrated curriculum? Well, because life is integrated, and by teaching subjects in isolation, children find it difficult to see the connections to their own lives. By planning experiences that cut across different subjects, it allows children to engage in relevant, meaningful activities that can be connected to real life. When children fail to see the point of learning something, it's because they can't connect it to real-world experiences in their own lives. Just think about how often kids in your classroom will say, well, why do we need to learn this? Well, it's because they haven't connected it to a real-life experience. And when you can plan experiences where students can actively engage in their learning and that simultaneously meets multiple curriculum outcomes, learning becomes more authentic. And of course, it cuts your planning time and makes teaching so much more fun. So how do you integrate? Integration usually involves two or more subject areas. When you think about it, English, language arts really integrates with everything. But the trick comes in when you have to consider in English the stories you'll read, the grammar you'll be teaching, or the writing conventions that you want to include. In those early years before formal teaching starts, teaching in themes, do you remember them? Used to be all the rage. And then that somehow fell out of favor. But here's the thing. Themes by themselves are meaningless to children unless they can actually make connections to their real life experiences. Because we have to remember that young children learn through their senses. This is why it makes my blood boil when I see pre-primary students learning about space and the planets and learning about the order of the planets. Firstly, it's not in the curriculum. And secondly, they cannot experience those planets or even the concept of space. All they can see is the sun and the moon and stars at night. So learning about space, for example, I'm just getting onto this little soapbox just quickly, is not developmentally appropriate for a 4 or 5-year-old. And if you really know the curriculum, you'll see that space comes much later when children are old enough to think abstractly. Now, I know you might say, oh, well, I have this child who's really interested in space. Well, fabulous. You create a little space section in your classroom with space books and provocations, and you allow and you encourage that child and other children, if there are children who are interested in space, to go and explore that. And you can chat about it, and the kid can come and talk about it if, you're getting them to talk about it during their circle time, but you're not teaching a whole topic on it. And themes are really also about the big picture. They're about broad topics like water or our identity or farm life or how has technology changed our lives. And honestly, I'm thinking themes in the early years should make a comeback. The reason I say this is based on the fact that we're seeing more and more children entering formal learning years with really poor vocabulary and language skills. But again, if you're going to teach themes well and deeply, It will mean integrating across subject areas and spending several weeks or even a whole term on this theme to make a truly meaningful experience, and one that is developmentally appropriate and where children can make connections to their own lives. And so today, I just want to focus on how can we, at the very least, integrate English language arts with science and perhaps even math. And stay to the end, because I'll tell you about a very free, nifty little resource I have for you that's going to help make your planning integrated experiences so much easier. Now, in those preschool years, you can think about, what are children really interested in? For young children, they are mostly interested only in themselves, their families, their friends, and animals. And when you're planning experiences, start by getting a whole bunch of picture books about the theme and then setting up provocations. Focus on vocabulary and using the words often. Don't forget about nursery rhymes, which are so important for phonological awareness. And then see where you can include mathematical concepts like measurement and graphing and weighing and hefting, for example. And most importantly, in these early years, allow the children's interests to lead the way. As educators, we need to be flexible. On a rainy day, for example, allow them to jump in puddles. You know, Claire Warden has a whole book on puddles as a provocation for learning. And I had a fabulous conversation with her in episode 24. So listen to that one after this one. And just think about it for a minute. You've got reflection happening in puddles. You've got evaporation. You've got absorption. Your biggest asset in these years is an inquiring mind. Be ready for those teachable moments and have your open-ended wonder questions up your sleeve so that you can use them to get kids thinking and wondering. And before you know it, you might be doing a whole unit of work on puddles and exploring why in some areas puddles disappear quickly. And in other areas, puddles take ages to disappear. Poems about puddles. You could use, stories about puddles, making rhymes about puddles. Find words in the puddles that you could use in making up a poem or a little story. Water, muddy, dirty, brown. The provocations and the opportunities to learn are only limited by our imaginations. You could even use a length of string and explore the circumference of a puddle and measure it, and a measuring stick to measure the depth of a puddle and the changes in the depth as it evaporates. Children could create art with muddy water and even explore making leaf boats to observe floating and sinking. You're really, again, only limited by your imagination. So let's look at how we can integrate science into our other learning experiences. And again, stay to the end because I'm going to be talking about the elephant in the room. Now, when you're planning science, I've always advocated for aligning science with the seasons. For example, in year 2, you want to learn about growth and change in spring. So here in Australia, that would be term 3. October to March are our windy months. So perhaps that's the time to include your physical science when you're learning about forces, because you can include wind as a force. Term 1 will be great for that because you can create wind sculptures and kites, for example. Chemical sciences, I've always left until term 4 because that explores change in matter. So that's your baking for your Christmas goodies or your pizzas or whatever it is you want to do there. And you can also explore textiles because we do a lot of textile crafts and which textiles are suitable for certain types of conditions, of course. And if you're making kites in term 1 and you'll be exploring the properties of materials to find the most suitable material for making kites, so that when you're working with your textiles again in term 4, you're revisiting that component of the curriculum. And then that leaves earth and space sciences, which is the water cycle. But there's so much to it. I think it's also important to remember that just because you teach the water cycle in term 2, for example, it's not done and dusted at the end of term 2. In the later part of term 2 and the first half of term 3, that's when it's raining. And as educators, we need to be alert to that. And we continue our discussions and continue checking our rain gauges that we made in term 2, for example, even in term 3. Because learning never stops. The one writing convention, when we're talking about the writing part or the English language part, that I like to teach very early on is procedural writing. And this is because procedural writing is such a big part of the science curriculum. So imagine you're teaching forces, let's say in term 1, and you'll be getting picture books about windy days and kite flying and kite making and forces. And with those picture books that you've chosen, you might be doing character descriptions about the main character and perhaps retelling the story and identifying the problem in the story. And at the same time, you're doing lots of hands-on experiments to discover the difference between push and pull. And you'll be creating a vocabulary wall, just like in themes where you practice including these words in your everyday language. You'll be using the words for learning about syllables. And even in year 1 and 2, investigate the endings of words or how words change when they become plurals, for example. And asking children to come up with a spelling rule for what happens to words when you add a Y, or what happens to a split digraph, how does that change? And this is why it's so important to choose good literature, because good books give you so much to explore when it comes to language. And then I like to use non-fiction texts, like in this instance, let's just keep talking about forces or wind, to learn about the actual subject matter in your small guided reading groups. That way, not only are you teaching about the topic, but you will also be focusing on comprehension and whatever other skills you want to teach in that guided reading lesson. It could be finding supporting facts or how to look for key words to answer questions. I've always used texts from A to Z Reading or Cool Australia, or even in Australia we have these RIC books that are linked to the Australian curriculum. Love using them too for my guided reading texts that link to a science topic or even a social studies topic that I'm teaching. Or sometimes just make a copy of a page or two from a non-fiction book and then set up your own questions. So that way you're teaching about your science or your social studies topic in your guided reading time. So really you're meeting the outcomes of multiple subject areas within one lesson. Your science unit will start, like all good teaching, by first finding out what kids already know. So you'll be doing a brainstorm. Maybe you'll use a mind map or perhaps a talking tub, which you can learn more about in my interview with Claire Warden, which I'll link in the show notes for you. You'll be asking questions and you'll be encouraging students to ask questions. And these questions are the catalyst for kicking off the learning and starting your learning wall, which Jessica Van spoke about in episode 26. So when it comes to the science component, if you've taught procedural writing, and I highly recommend Talk for Writing, I just love using Pi Corbett's Talk for Writing across the curriculum to teach non-fiction writing like procedural writing. It's so much fun to teach writing in this way. So I'll leave a link to that in the show notes too. So you'll be teaching this procedural writing and your procedure on how to make a kite, for example, or how to make a wind chime, or how to make a boat that floats. So now you're using that learning and children are applying it to their own project. And in true Talk for Writing style, they're telling their procedure several times before they write it. And of course, children could also decorate their kite. So perhaps in art, you're learning about, complementary colors that they could use in the design of their kite to decorate it. Or perhaps you've studied an artist and you're decorating the kite in the style of that artist. That's just something simple, but it works. And then children can see how art is applied to products, making it very authentic and very real. And who knows, there might be a budding surface designer in your class. For the maths component, what about looking for and identifying the shapes that make up the kite? Looking at the sides, the apex, the corners. In making of the kite, children are applying real-world geometry. But the learning here comes from the questioning. And I have a list of questions on my site which are great for these kind of moments. So I'll link that in the show notes for you too. Now, by making this kite, by the way, which also meets the outcomes for design and technology. So here again, if you get children to think about, and this is where good worksheet is handy, they draw and they plan and they label their kite and their design. They list the materials that they're going to use. And of course, you're having them talk about the procedure and they write the procedure. And once the kite is complete, they take a photograph of it using an iPad. Again, you've just integrated technology. And then they print it off and they cut it out and they glue it onto the space beside their plan. And then they go off and they test their kite. So I have this great little planning sheet that you can use for just this kind of learning with children. And I'll link that in the show notes. So now you've got the testing day where all the children go off to test their kite in the wind, or the day that they go and they see if their boat floats in a tub of water. And you could even invite your buddy class or parents to this kite testing day. And again, making the kite itself will be tricky for some children. But I've done it very successfully with just myself and my education assistant. But you could also buddy up with older students who could help the younger students with the making of the kite or the boat or whatever. But here's the thing. When you're helping, or if you're getting helpers in, be that your educational assistant or parents or grandparents or an older buddy class, you don't change the child's design. You honor their design and you follow their instructions exactly, even if you know that it's not going to work. The next part is where the real learning happens, when the kite perhaps doesn't work. This is when you're using those questions and you're encouraging a child to really think and analyze why this kite isn't flying. Or if they're making boats from recycled materials, why won't it float? Why does it keep toppling over? This is where the inquiry and the critical thinking comes in. They then have to make adjustments or perhaps a whole new kite or a whole new boat so that it does work as intended. This step is often one that many teachers omit, but actually it's the most important step of all, because these are the transferable skills that children apply to every other thing they're learning about. And it's also that metacognition at work here. It gets them thinking about how they're learning. And then, of course, comes reflection and discussion. And this again is where that critical thinking, that analyzing, that problem solving comes in, and communication, of course. And afterwards, where they can talk in their small groups or as a whole class about their experience and what they learned. And again, I highly recommend you listen to the interview I had with Jessica Vance in episode 26, where she talks about learning walls. Jessica talks about not having a science wall and an English wall and a maths wall, but just a learning wall where that whole integrated unit of learning is up and it's visible, where children can track their learning and their understanding. I'll share a quick story with you about integrating planting into your learning. So when I was teaching about growth and change, of course that was in year 2, I, of course, had the silkworm eggs and the mealworms on my provocation table, but also seeds and plants. And I was very lucky to have a little outside area where I had large tubs, and every year the children planted something, usually lettuce and beans, and I've also done potatoes in the past. So we usually decide together what to plant, or sometimes I have a selection of seeds, and then they decide what they want to plant. But we always plant into our large tubs, and then the children also do their own little planting in a cup. So we planted our seedlings and they grew, and it was time to go away for the holidays. But before we left, I told the children that it might be a good idea to measure our seedlings so that we could see exactly how much they grew over the holidays while we were away. And so we used Unifix cubes to measure how tall each seedling was, or each child chose a seedling and that's the one they measured. And we took a photo, and then each child had the opportunity to do that. They glued the photo into their maths books, and when we returned after the holidays, we measured the seedling again with the Unifix cubes and noted there was a difference in the height of the plant. And this is how I introduced the language of difference in mathematics to the children. The difference was the amount that the plant had grown. And then, through them experimenting with the Unifix cubes, they figured out how you would work it out. And of course, that was by subtracting the smaller number of cubes from the larger amount of cubes, and the difference was the answer. And I still remember how excited the kids were about this. It was the application of real learning to their lives. And after that, they were so keen to explore this difference concept in all sorts of things, the difference in their ages, the difference in their heights, and so on. And I mentioned that I had a little something for you in the beginning to help you, and that's a free technology planning sheet. And I link it in the show notes for you to use whenever your students are planning technology projects, whether it's making kites or boats or animals from recycled materials. It doesn't matter, it's totally generic. I also have another sheet for you, which I'll also link, which is a planning sheet to help you plan an integrated curriculum. But now, there's a very large elephant in the room, and that is that many elementary schools are starting to take the teaching of science away from the classroom teachers and getting science specialist teachers to teach science. Now that's all very groovy in the high school years, but in my opinion, in primary school and most importantly in the early childhood years, this is a really bad idea. Not only does it compartmentalize learning, which is the opposite of what good teaching is, but let's just get real. Very few classroom teachers get together with specialist teachers to plan integrated units. There just isn't time. And often, what you want to teach doesn't align with the science specialist's plans. But guess what? There have actually been studies about how effective specialist teaching is in elementary schools, and the research clearly shows that not only do specialist teachers not teach as well as they did when they were generalists, probably because they don't have enough time, but student performance actually went down. And ultimately, the reason for this is the fact that specialist teachers don't have enough time with those students to build relationships with them. And as someone who has been in both roles, I can tell you that when you're only seeing a class once a week for 50 minutes, and in some schools even less than that, that's not enough time to build relationships and really get to know children. Specialists don't often know the backstories of children, or if there was an incident at home that morning, because as a specialist, there isn't time before every class to have a debrief session with a classroom teacher. So as we go forward, I really hope that school leaders will take a long, hard look at the research and what's best for students when it comes to teaching and timetabling, because ultimately, we need to do what's good for students, not what suits us. And I'll leave links in the show notes to the studies that I found online for you to check out. Hey, so I hope today's episode inspired you to plan a more integrated curriculum. I've spoken in other episodes about how to plan, and I'll link these episodes in the show notes for you too. And hey, if you like listening to Blooming Curious and you find the content interesting or thought-provoking, then please share it with others by clicking on that share button. And you can also pay me the ultimate compliment by leaving a review. And you can do that by going to the show, not this individual episode, and scroll to where it says leave a review. Thanks so much. That will really help the show be discovered by more people, because podcast platforms actually push the shows with lots of reviews higher up on the pile. So I'd like to thank you for listening today. Don't forget to check out the show notes for all the links, and I'll see you next week, same time, same place. And until then, stay blooming curious.